It's my great pleasure now to introduce Richard Rogers. Richard Rogers, the 2007 Pritzker Architecture Prize laureate, has a significant body of work in historic cities with such pioneering buildings as the Centre Pompidou in Paris, designed in collaboration with Renzo Piano, and Lloyds of London. He's been a strong advocate for the creation of harmonious landscapes by juxtaposition of buildings of different styles, each reflecting the time of their conception, which he has referred to as harmony by juxtaposition. He also has a wealth of experience in urban master planning and is strongly committed to improving the quality of the urban environment and creating richly layered cities, as demonstrated by his roles as chair of the UK government's Urban Task Force on the state of our cities, chief advisor on architecture and urbanism to the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, advisor on design to its current mayor, Boris Johnson, and advisor to the mayor of Barcelona's Urban Strategies Council. It's my pleasure to welcome Richard Rogers to the podium and his talk, Continuity and Change, the Language of Architecture.
Good evening. Can you hear me? No?
Yes.
Good. That's a good start. I'm not very good with technology. I thought by calling this talk Continuity and Change, there would be one area where there wouldn't be much argument, because that's exactly what we're talking about. What I've come away with from the previous four lectures is there are many ways of continuing and changing. There really are many ways. I think this is a wonderful conference, and I'd like to thank Getty for setting it up, because it certainly made me think about the way that we are moving forward. Architecture is an expression of the time, the zeitgeist of the time, translated by the technology of the time. When I think of Chicago, which is, to me, the equivalent of Florence, which is where I was born, in America, I think not only of the amazing beauty of the buildings, but also the fact that they were the first with a steel frame, with a telephone, with a lift. That's all made it possible to go upwards. So it's that marriage that I will be talking about. I'm very excited, and have always been excited, by those periods of change. I'm more excited by early Gothic than by Perpendicular and late. I'm more excited by Brunelleschi than I am by Michelangelo. I've always thought that Brunelleschi's dome in Florence is much better than St. Peter's, partly because of that marriage between engineering, art, and architecture. So I should be talking a little bit about that. The cave, which you see here, and those wonderful Lascaux cave paintings in France. The beginning of mankind, the beginning of man as a civil man, who for many thousands of years lived in these caves, which allowed one both to be functional because they were easy to protect, they didn't leak, they allowed the meeting of people, and most important, you could paint on the walls. And then man, and I use man as mankind, and then man thought, we've got to do more. We've got to be more adventurous. And the primitive hut was built. And the primitive hut leaked. It blew over. You couldn't paint on the walls. But you could move it. And you could start farming, which created the first societies in Euphrates some 6,000 years ago. And of course, you could extend the gene pool. You could chase the women. That sort of innovation is what I find amazing about mankind, that striving for the newness and the betterness, and also harmony, because it is, we as architects, our search is for harmony. I will be talking, as you heard, about the fact that there are at least two ways in which harmony can be achieved. One by a dialogue between different styles and buildings, and another by fitting in. This is one of the most magnificent views in England, across the greens at Cambridge to the great Gothic cathedral, great Gothic church, or chapel to be exact, and to James Gibbs' classical building to the right and the medieval to the left. Nobody would say that this is not harmonious. They each express very clearly the period of their time and use the highest art of that time. Venice, and when we talk about St. Marco's, we tend to think of the internal square, but this is the view which we all see as we cross the water. And there cannot be more different pieces of buildings. A Byzantine palace, a completely wacky church, a campanile which you could never get planning permission today, with a green top, red brick. It completely doesn't fit in, does it? Still, it makes it, and of course that wonderful library. The point I'm making is it's much more complicated than fitting in. If it's fitting in, it means purely harmony, which is one of the ways, then it's not enough, because we keep on seeing things which are tremendously harmonious. In fact, I would suggest that the most exciting buildings, those wonderful Renaissance buildings, let's say, again back in Florence, are exciting because you see them against a medieval background. It would be much less exciting. In fact, they are much less exciting when you see all the Renaissance building put together in most situations. Florence, the great Piazza della Signoria, the Palazzo Vecchio, started about 11th century, Tower about 12th century. When Vasari came along, he did something which I feel still is the right process. He extended and repaired what we'll call the left-hand side. That's an extension. And he repaired it exactly. You can't see the line. When he came to the museum, which is this, he used the high Renaissance Mannerist style, the style of his period. You can see it continuing just down there. It's in that age. And again, the loggia, yet again different. And again, that's different. And yet again, we call it harmony. But really the point I want to make is that Vasari, and you can see it even better in this wonderful print, Vasari, actually, that was the new part just about down there. Vasari used those two languages very clearly and in a way which I greatly enjoy. Now, it was very planned. You can see that the whole view was the great walk through one of the world's greatest museums, under the arches and along here, ends up being exactly on line with the tower and the great Brunelleschi dome in the distance. Set piece, which both marks care and love for repair and the invention of the new. For the good of the bad, and probably for obviously enjoyment of the bad, we didn't have Sullivan and Richardson in England. Right? What we did have was some great railway stations, some wonderful palmhouses. We had tremendous steelworks. And that's where a lot of us got our influences after the war, 1950s, 1960s, Norman Foster, myself, and up to Renzo Piano as well. And that is what we built on. They're neither right or wrong. Those are our roots. We were reacting, of course, to this over-the-top Austrian palazzo with such decoration, with such showmanship, of such wealth. And we were greatly influenced instead by the Casura Palace, which I've always believed that was the beginning of the modern movement, though it was 400 years before the modern movement. Paper, scrub boards, mats, sand. Those are sort of our roots. And again, I put forward the fact that it's difficult to say that things don't fit in. They sometimes don't fit in, but it depends how good that design is. And it's a much more complicated question, as I said. I apologize if I use some of my buildings, or in fact mainly the buildings of my practice, and I greatly believe in teamwork. So when I talk about mine, I really mean all the wonderful people I've worked with, both clients and architects. This is the fish market, the Billingsgate fish market in England, heavily used, designed by an architect called Horace, who also designed the Tower Bridge. And you can see the state it was in when we were asked to look at it. And we did very much what Vasari did. We reinstituted the building as it was, and inside and on the sides actually, we built it the way that we knew was the right way to do it, because it was too different. It was responding to demands which we couldn't be responded by the vernacular of that time. You can actually see, I think, Lloyds in the background as well. So in a way, what we're looking for is an architecture which responds to 20th and now 21st century demands of change, of growth and change. This wonderful palazzo, static, frozen music, as it was called, where everything was perfect, nothing could be taken away. A harmony of the ages. And we were learning of course from it, we were looking at the possibilities, and this is a sketch of Lloyds, the first sketches of Lloyds of London, insurance market. Something could grow and change on the basis that buildings should be able to change in response to the constraints, the changing constraints. For example, Lloyds of London started as everything was still sort of written actually with in ink and pen. And of course, by the time we finished Lloyds, which is in the early 80s, everything was computerized. The same can go for the Pompidou, or Beaubourg, as we would call it. Massive library inside it. It was all books when we started, and there were practically no books by the time we finished it. Things changed. We had to mix the departments, mix the spaces. So we were looking for something which was possible to adapt, to layer, and to also, of course, play with the light and shadow, which is, again, what this is all about, the play of light and shadow, proportion, and so on. So without giving way, or without giving up the idea that buildings have to have proportions, there are the play of light and shadow, there is a rhythm. We try to develop the styles which have been developed before. On the right is G Street's law courts, the 19th century, the principal law courts in London. I put it here because, of course, it's got a fantastic skyline. And also because along the base, pedestrians can walk in shelter, which is pretty important in London. So it meets many of the requirements. Also, you can look at it on the diagonal. In other words, it builds up. And as London is basically, especially the city of London, is medieval streets, you don't have the grand views you have in New York, let us say. It's all bits and pieces. Now, this is Lloyds of London, again, reaching up to the sky, learning a lot about what you can do on the fifth elevation, the sky elevation, and using towers, and I'll talk about that in a moment, as a way in which you could, again, dialogue between a four-square building, which had a long life, and the short-term towers. The site, again, as I mentioned, there's a site, I can't see it, but the site up there, you can see how Lloyds had to cram into a space which was completely irregular. So we used the towers to use the free space. And I think it fits in extremely tightly, but also, I hope, very well. And you can see the dialogue between the towers and the four-square building. Now, one of the reasons is not only the aesthetic, that juxtaposition, the play of light and shadow between the simple glass facade or the translucent glass facade and the stainless steel towers, but also because appliances and mechanical systems have a much shorter life. It's like any engine. And in fact, they're changing most of it. Air conditioning is now being radically changed since when we started putting it 30 years ago. And yet they don't want any interruption in the work they do inside. So instead of putting it all on the inside of the building, we put it on the outside of the building, and it has both an aesthetic and I think it has also a technical reason for doing it. You can see from that, building fabric in London is probably getting on for 100 years, and of course city infrastructure goes on for hundreds of years. And also we said, there's the basic plan. This would be the normal plan, but as this is actually, it's a market space. It's selling insurances. Therefore, you can't have a core inside. So the core has to go, and this would be a traditional, in fact, this is the traditional plan, where the movement systems with the electrics, the toilets, and all the wet systems are on the outside. And what we did is we separated it completely. The site goes that way, as you saw before, and gave complete freedom inside. Now, we've always said this one day, and it probably will be, when it stops being an insurance market and it stops being an office building, it may be a university. It can be adapted. It is sustainable. It also has tremendously efficient energy systems, triple glass, where the air conditioning goes through. I mentioned that this is medieval views. These are the glimpses. When we studied the building, we went into two of the taller hills. We have very few hills in London, unfortunately. But we did go up the hills, and we looked at the skyline. And then we wanted the building to unwrap and unravel as you approached it. So you had to have different pieces, different types of light and shadow. That's the great atrium. So that begins to be part of the grammar, what I would call the grammar of architecture. In greater detail, this column, and this again is a grammar, an expression of how the building is put together. Now again, for us, the process of construction is a critical part of what buildings get scale from. At one level, the scale comes from these pieces, that's the staircases, the ducts and so on, the big atrium, the structure. At another level, the much smaller scale. And then this is the glass. London, this was really a London club. Lloyds of London was much more like a club. They didn't want people to look in. We invented this sort of glass. And we had it triple, and as I said, air conditioning went through it. But this is a language which we have slowly built up. On the left is still Lloyd's, and then on the right is 42 Leadenhall Street, which is not yet completed, nearly completed. It leans back, as you'll see in a moment, because there's a view of St. Paul's. Much of London is controlled by views, nearly more than heights. And certain places like the Tower of London or Richmond Hill, these have to be open views. So there's a view there, and we had to slope back out of that view. That obviously gives you, in some ways, I'm always saying, it's constraints that give you the possibility of design. They may be a pain at first, but if you turn them upside down, that's where the ideas come from. It's the difficulties. You had to slope this building backwards in some way or the other. It could be in steps, it could be shorter, but you couldn't do it in the normal way. That gave us this ability. On the ground is a 7-story little park, which there's no glass, it just goes right the way through. So the public domain is critical. The public domain is always a critical part of what we design. What is quite interesting again is that, and maybe you see it better in a moment, is the dialogue. So here again, that's the new building on this area here, which is going up. Actually, it's rather out of date. And that is Lloyds of London. Now we thought that was technology 40 years ago, but actually it's handcrafted technology. Today, you do it in a totally different way. The technology is much more computerized, it comes in great lengths, and therefore you respond in that way, in the aesthetic response to those needs. You see here on this one here, in this image here, why Lloyd steps back, because actually it steps away, so you can get that view from off. So it's free. It's free St. Paul's, and there's St. Paul's. Now, we had tremendous problems with Lloyd's. We are having some problems with Leadenhall, but Lloyd's was attacked by everybody. Not as bad as Pompidou. Actually, Pompidou, I have to say, and we'll come to it in a moment, we never had a good piece of press in our lives. Actually, that's not totally true. There was one good piece, I remember it written on my heart, in 1973 by Ada Louise Huxtable. But that was the only thing in 6 years. But of course, when it opened, then people started queuing up, and it became the most popular public building in Europe. then the press changed. So it does vary. And here, too, we had tremendous attacks from heritage, from Prince Charles, and so on. We'll come back to that. I put this as one of the many, many competitions we didn't win. Park Avenue, New York, standard office buildings. There's nothing more difficult, standard office buildings, because in a way they're just repetitive floors, one above the other, one above the other, and there's very little you can do. And I often say, especially I'm working on ground zero, and you do turn around to the client when he says, look, I want it to be this meters by this, I want it this amount of, these feet by these, this X feet from the core to the wall, and the core will be designed by some well-known Canadian firm, and you say, what am I doing as an architect here? I mean, I can turn, maybe I can have curved corners, probably not. So you are left with practically nothing but, floor upon floor. Anyhow, there were some possibilities here, not least because there wasn't enough floor space to optimize the full height of the building. So we did have vertical space to play with, and you can see these two. And basically what we decided to do is to create a really strong public domain. So we put a forest, more or less, on each one of these floors, wherever is the gap. There. And that's one of the forests. And we thought what we would do is go and take a forest, actually find a forest somewhere up the Hudson, high trees, and just move it up onto the space here. Again, it's part of the question of how do you use your imagination and what can you do to extend the use of buildings to that purely functional element, which is very, very important, of the user. But then most people are not the users who see the building. Most of the people are the people who are passing by. Pompidou, Beaubourg. Competition won with Renzo Piano, with Ovab's engineer, wonderful engineer, Peter Rice. We work extremely close with our engineers. We work from day one with our engineers. And perhaps this facade, the most important part, well, number one, it wasn't built like this, but I'll come to that. But number two was the first words in the report was a place for all people, all ages, all creeds, the poor and the rich. A cross between the British Museum and Times Square. In other words, study and fun, a people's fun place. And that's the whole concept. And then also where in those days most big buildings would be put in the middle of the site, we said, no, we'll put it on the edge. That gives you the biggest square. There were nearly 700 entries. I have to say, if I'd known the 700 entries when we entered it, I would never have entered it. But anyhow, but we were sufficiently naive in those days, Renzo and I, not to realize what an impossible thing we were trying to do. So we put this up, and the idea of the facade was that you could communicate with all the other cultural establishments in the world, whether it was sort of the museums in America or the libraries in other places and so on. Of course, this drawing, it was smaller than this, and if you look more carefully, it's actually very much an anti-Vietnam facade, but that's not what it was meant to be. And in fact, it failed in there, not because anyone recognized what those pictures were, because I think they accepted they were going to be culture, but when Pompidou died and Giscard took over, and we had everything in place to make this amazing electronic facade, and we had the money for it, etc. And then Giscard asked that terrible questions, which is, who is going to control it, the left or the right? And we said, no, culture, but he didn't believe it. So it is a people's place. It is a place where the whole ground area is people. And as you can see, it's public space, and the whole facade. And the streets in the air, and escalators. And the area really is about creating a place where people could see each other. And of course, we were extremely fortunate. I don't think we realized because winning it in France, I guess practically no one promenades as well as the French do. And so they really took over the building and walked all over it. And again, it's all about overlapping activities. I believe strongly that exciting things can happen when you can overlap activities. Again, one of the problems about office buildings is they tend to be single activity buildings. They're getting less now. Here, of course, we were able to have cafes, cinemas, restaurants, the best library in Paris, the best museum, Museum of Modern Art, the best IRCAM, the best research music with Boulez. So we were able to overlap these activities. So it appealed to a vast number of people. Having said all that and all the activities, the real activity everybody's enjoyed, as you can see here, is people meeting people, which is what cities are about. In terms of technology and in terms of the excitement we get from technology, as the Gothic and flying arches, which I keep on repeating back to, because I mean, the flying arch allowed suddenly the church to get closer to God. It rose up above it. In a way, these brackets, which we call Gerberets, are the 800 years later interpretation of those Gothic arches. We didn't think about it any more than we really thought about the piazza looking like the Campo in Siena. But of course, those things are stored in one's mind. They are there even if we don't directly copy it. They influence us. And here, and this is very much Peter Rice, you see a very careful expression of the forces that are working. The compression column in the center, the big brackets, because you can't have a double column because otherwise all the logo is down here, so you have to pull down on this side. It's a pure expression. And that's what, in a way, gives this building scale. It's also a question of humanizing the technology. In other words, it's not just technology. You can see the scale. There's a man there. You can see the scale of these pieces, and you can see this man shaping it. I mean, he's just like a piece of sculpture. He's giving shape. There's not an exact shape to this because we're not that accurate. So there is a human element within all the things that we're doing. So we don't believe that technology is the answer. We believe that technology should be mastered to the aid of creating harmony. And everything has to move. And these joints, these wonderful joints, which go all the way up here, where there's space for all the pieces to move. And we're back, I think, finally, to the key thing about cities and about Pompidou is people watching people. And the idea that movement can be fun. You don't have to go into an elevator and you are sort of 6'3" high and you've got a 3-foot high person with his head in your stomach. You don't have to do that. You can have a view across Paris instead. Just a little story about the unpopularity of Pompidou. I remember once being outside and it was pouring with rain, and a very kind lady said, come under my umbrella. And I sort of sheltered under her umbrella. And for once, and I should have known better, when she said, and what do you think of this building? I said, I'm the architect. And she hit me on the head with the umbrella. You could argue if everybody likes your building, you've got a problem as well. Again, this is really about scale, the relationship between leaves, the hand, the parts, and the pieces. This building, had it been, in my opinion, it doesn't matter whether it's stone, brick, glass, this scale, it would be gigantic. We hope we broke down scale by playing with the pieces, by shaping the pieces, by getting a harmony between the parts. Moving on, Barcelona, fantastic city. I mean, one of the greatest cities in the world, and has changed over the last 30 years in a magnificent way, with some amazing mayors, terrific leadership, and I've had great enjoyment working in this city. This was the bull ring. First of all, there are practically no bulls. In fact, it's against the law. In this part of Spain, and secondly, they happen to have two, so everything goes wrong, they've still got the other one. Anyhow, they decided that they wanted to keep this bull ring. It's not a specifically great piece of heritage building, but it is a very important place. It's round, and therefore people circle around it. B, everybody knows where it is, and it's positioned at the bottom of a wonderful flight of steps and stairs to the neighboring hill where the Olympics are on. Makes it very important. It was a very difficult job because, in fact, the ground slopes and half of this was underground, half above, and so we had to add all these props. And we had to add, this is really just a skin of a 4.5-inch brick, basically. And then within these activities, there's sports, there's cinemas, there's retail, there's metro systems and so on. So it's a real mixed area. And of course, lots of bars along the top. So again, it's a place where people meet. One of its success stories was that it opened on the same day as the Pope came to see the Sacra Familia, and more people came to see this than the Sacra Familia. Sorry about it. And there it is in some detail. Again, as you notice, as you know, we love color. We love to use color as one of the ranges. It's like light and shadow. It's part of the way that you can strengthen or change the atmosphere of a building. The reason that fairs are colorful is because it's a moment of happiness. And I'm always saying, there is more than black and white and gray to life. Changing completely, a winery 2 hours north of Madrid, with a beautiful castle on the top of the hill, a wonderful medieval castle, and a village which at first I thought there must be car parking everywhere because there were little things popping out of the ground, but actually the whole village is propped up, and the whole village is one big cellar below ground. I mean, everything is a cellar. So they wanted to build one of this winery, and it's really again about the relation between, again, more classical materials, the castle, and the activities that go on inside this winery. There's the castle. It's a wonderful sight. And again, it's basically brick. It's tile. I'm just trying to prove we don't always build in steel. And changing again to the British Museum, an extension of the British Museum, extremely difficult site, terrible problems with heritage. There was a so-called Georgian house on this, just about here, a Georgian house. And they say, well, you can't do this because it's a Georgian house. And I said, no, it's not a Georgian house. It wasn't built in the 18th century. It was built in 1982. And they said, we don't care, it still is a Georgian house. And then we said, but look, this Georgian house has a staircase which goes up all behind the windows. You just don't do that in Georgian. So we had fantastic, it took us months of argument, until in the end we came to a compromise, which was, okay, you can pull the Georgian house down, but you've got to keep the facade up. Once we got that far, even I knew they'd have to give in, because at that point we had a 19th century mock Georgian facade, which was 4.5-inch brick, and then we won it. But the point, now having said that, and I'm happy to discuss it later, I think heritage does do a tremendous job within Britain. Again, the British Museum, of course, you can't go above the skyline in this area. And I remember when I first came to England from Italy, being brought along by my grandfather to what was then the only real skyscraper in Europe, which was this one, which tells you also about the height, which in fact, this question about height, it does fascinate me. There's a very interesting report about the Strozzi Palace in Florence, which, okay, it's a 4-story palazzo, equivalent to probably 10 stories, because it's a wonderful, and people people objecting around it. This is 13th century, 14th century actually, 1300, objecting to the height of this tower. So height is interesting. And I think we get much too frightened about height, in my opinion. I mean, it depends where it is, how it is. Clusters of buildings, which you have very successfully in places like Chicago and in New York, where you get the space between those towers, can be very exciting. Anyhow, having said that, which is fascinating how much things have changed. That's actually, I put it here because it's Renzo piano, wonderful Phillips Library, in Morgan Library in New York. And again, this interesting question about how much do you look at your neighbor, what do you keep of its rhythm, of its style, of its form, and how do you handle it? And it was interesting to see this morning the same image being put up of Smithson's building in St. James's, which I think is one of the great and very successful buildings, which sits into one of the wealthiest areas of London, St. James's. and where it picks up the scale, the grain, and yet is totally modern. It's next to a wonderful 18th century Boodles Club on the left, and it does excite anybody who goes here. It's actually 2 towers, which you can just about see, and 1 piece which is joined to the building. So it's a fantastic plan as well. So I think, Denise, who showed us this morning, actually with a better view than I've got, showed how much it integrates into the building, and it does not pretend to be something which it isn't. I couldn't but help putting this up, which is the National Gallery. There were a number of competitions. We were in one competition, and this was our response. Now, this is the great, it used to be the square, it used to be called the Heart of an Empire. It's actually a traffic circle in those days. And there are lots of people showing that, very few people could get onto it. And then you had this space here, which is the site and the extension of, well, this is the National Gallery. So it's a very important site because it closes off, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This element here, so there is a sort of practically regular towers all the way down here. So we inserted this building, and this was our entry. In those days, there was an office building at the lower half, so it's a very different program to the Venturi, Dean Scott Brown winning entry of a later competition. We tried to balance, we did balance the towers. It has a very strange cupola, this building, which I always think is a sort of, they must have run out of money on this cupola here, because it seems to be out of scale with everything else to me. But it's rather beautiful facade. So what we thought we'd do is to create a tower which would put pressure upon that point and go back to that wonderful St. Martin's in the Fields. So there's a sort of element in that area, and enclose off the space which leaks down to the left towards St. James's. And at that point, because we didn't dare, it was a competition, so we linked it below ground. You can see a tunnel here. So you didn't have to cross, so at least there'd be a link to what could be a great square. Later on, let's see. This makes those 3 points I mentioned. This has still got a roundabout, a traffic circle, the 3 points of the 3 towers, the 4th one being Nelson's Column, and creating a geometrical point between those. We thought it was a sort of one of the ways in which we could tie the new wing into this area. And at the same time, build that wing with the technology which we understood, with the language which we knew, and inside it was totally flexible. In other words, we had roof lights which could be changed and moved, and whoever was in charge of the museum at that time could change the inside to fit his beliefs, which of course is very much Pompidou as well. And that was the drawing of it. There was bars and so on at the top, and then the idea was that you could walk underneath the square to the building. That is the funny sort of little cupola in the center, and that was the museum, and that was an office building below, which was this, which later the Sainsbury's thankfully gave them money to actually build this all as a museum, rather than half a commercial office and half a museum. Trafalgar Square now, and after that we did a project called London as It Could Be, and which really started to look at the planning of how to make London a more humanistic city, how to give way to the people rather than the cars. And everyone was amazed to find out that in London, every square has many more people, even the ones with traffic like this, than there were people in cars. And somehow we had been slowly eroding the public domain, especially by vehicles. So this has now become a very successful pedestrian square, and at the top is the National Gallery. Philip Johnson rummaging through history. This is a very old... It says the postmodernist architect rummages in the dustbin of history, picking out Egyptian, classical, and Art Deco and Bauhaus ideas. Probably the most powerful person on the jury for Boberg was actually Philip Johnson, so I owe him a lot. I still put that up. I put this partly because this belonged actually to the same competition as the one that won it. But what was interesting, at the same time, he was building that in the center of the Louvre. And you are slightly left thinking, well, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? Or is it a reflection that England is totally traditional and France had Mitterrand? And of course, I was strongly at war and have been at war for a very long time with Prince Charles. And he's much more powerful than I am. But it doesn't stop one from having this continuous battle. And the difficulty is, of course, you're having a battle with somebody who refuses to answer. In other words, Buckingham Palace stated when the British BBC and the Royal Academy and the RIBA said, let's have an open discussion, especially about the National Gallery when it first came through. The answer from Buckingham Palace was, the prince does not debate. And I wrote some pretty heavy articles on that question about democracy and princes that don't debate. So I'm not very popular, but there we are. Last slide, no, one more after that. Last image. I thought I'd put here, this is Ruth in my house. I put it here because it is a Georgian house. It's a sort of, I think, grade 2 conservation. Obviously, we had to keep the facade. But this sort of facade is really the equivalent to an absolutely standard modern facade with a standard glass or whatever material. And it's totally flexible. Now, we were very lucky to be able to change the interior, and we made some pretty good excuses, not least that it was bombed at one point sometime during the Second World War, etc. So we were able to get away with changing the interior. And I suppose, again, there's one or 2 points I wanted to make. One is that I think there is absolutely no problem about that relationship between the old and the new, about the staircase, which I am very proud of, and the very beautiful facade on the outside. It's also, in a sense, the way that we live. We live in a very sort of, what we call this the living room. We call it the piazza. People are always moving through it, and we have a fantastic view. Again, it's very much about what I believe in, what we believe in. And of course, Ruthie is a cook. And as you can see from this, the chef. This is all about food, the importance of food, forms of coming together, and the importance of marriage between the past and the present. And very finally, I put it there because, as I said, modernity excites me. Nothing excites me more than modernity. Now, modernity in itself is neither good or bad, but it is a power if used properly. This is the outside of the Pompidou. This is the staircases up the outside. It's also the streets in the air, if we can get it to work. Those are the streets there, as you can see, the escalators going in. It's also about the layering. I'm very excited about layerings of buildings, the play of light and shadow. Modern technology allows you to do this because it's much lighter, it's much airier. Therefore, you don't have to have solid blank walls. You can do things with it, which you can't or you couldn't before. So this is about excitement, enjoyment, and the good fortune I've had of addressing you. Thank you very much.